Good evening, everybody. Hello, you're very welcome. And my name is Aidan Farrelly. I'm a youth worker, a lecturer in Maynooth University in Youth Studies, and I'm also a Social Democrats councillor for Kildare County Council. I would like to start by welcoming you all to our second Left Bank webinar, entitled Challenging the Narrative, Overcoming Stigma and Inequality in Our Social Welfare System. The Left Bank series of webinars seeks to focus on specific topical issues with a laser-sharp focus. Before we get started, I would like to draw your attention to the Mentimeter link, and we might do this together. So I'm going to share my screen, and what we're going to ask you to do with Mentimeter is to simply answer one question. So I'll share my screen and we'll do it together. So hopefully everyone can see that. So if you go to menti.com, menti.com, and if you enter this code here, 66751083. I'll leave that on the screen for a second so you can see it. So it's menti.com, MENTI, and the code is 66751083. And when you've done that and you click submit, it will bring you through to answer one simple question. How would you rate social welfare supports? A simple 1 to 5, pre-COVID and during COVID. And when you've got that done, what it will do is it'll start telling us what the group has to say on that. So hopefully everyone's gotten through. Menti.com. You have the code and then just put in your two answers there. How would you rate social welfare supports pre-COVID and during COVID? And when you've those both finished, then you can click submit. And let's see if our technology is working. So it should start coming up. Aha, you see? So here it'll show us then some of the answers starting to come through, and it'll give us an idea of where we are in the group. So while you're still doing that, I'll just give you a brief overview of this evening. So we will be discussing specifically the pandemic unemployment payment and in more broader terms, the social welfare system in Ireland. In April 2021, Minister for Finance, Paschal Donoghue, promised there would be no cliff edge for those in receipt of PUP payment. But for many, this impending change presents a reality of exactly that. The government's decision to reduce this payment by €50 in September, with additional cuts coming in November and then in February, have the potential to cause what we believe untold damage to those who need these payments the most. Back, let's not forget, to a figure that they themselves acknowledged is simply not enough at €200. And as we start to see the narrative change, with the Department of Social Protection, for example, declaring upwards of 3,000 notifications from employers saying that their staff won't return to work, we in the Social Democrats believe that it's important to create this space this evening to discuss the government's policies and ultimately the social welfare system and its decision in its values to reduce this payment. Which brings me nicely along to introducing you to our wonderful panel of speakers this evening. We're starting with Zoe Hughes from the Carers Alliance, and from there we will welcome Breed O'Brien from the Irish National Organisation for the Unemployed. Joe Whelan from University College Cork will be our third speaker before we round off the evening with Social Democrats TD and spokesperson for social protection, along with many other briefs, the chair of our parliamentary party, Gary Gannon. So let's take a quick look. So we see pre-COVID, we have a lot of answers in roughly around the 2 out of 5. And then during COVID, we see that that rises up a little bit more to an average of just over 3.3. I won't make any assumptions on those, but maybe our speakers, our panelists can do so. And it is time to welcome our first speaker. So let me stop sharing my screen. We are very thankful to be joined this evening by Zoe Hughes from the Carers Alliance. Zoe joined Care Alliance Ireland in January of 2015. Zoe has qualifications in social work, social policy, and disability studies. And her past work has included working with a number of academic and voluntary sector organisations. She has a particular interest in the topic of diversity within caring, along with inclusive and participatory research methods. Zoe is currently Senior Policy and Research Officer and coordinates the Care Alliance research and policy functions. Zoe, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
I can indeed.
Excellent, great stuff. I'm just going to quickly share my slides and just so I don't forget anything. And hopefully this will work now. There we go. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aidan, for that introduction, and thank you, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak tonight. It was very nice to get the invitation, and I'm really pleased to be here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over really sort of the idea of social welfare, family caring, and stigma in Ireland. So I kind of wanted to put the family care spin on looking at social welfare and stigma and how that perhaps has been impacted as part of COVID-19. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about the PUP payment actually, because it's not something that I have a particular expertise or knowledge in. So I'm hoping that this will kind of just start the conversation. So, I mean, I'm sure most people who are watching here now will have an idea of what I mean by the term family care or carer. But in general, we use the census of population kind of definition of it. So that's someone who provides regular unpaid personal help to a friend or a family member. It doesn't have to be a family member, even though that's kind of in the term that we use. But it's that kind of help or support that is necessary because of a long-term illness or a health problem or a disability, and that kind of personal help also includes help with basic tasks such as feeding, dressing, etc. And so what do family carers do? I mean, they kind of do a little bit of everything, really. You know, you've got sort of help with medication, help with daily household tasks, help with personal hygiene, financial management, just general one-to-one support, advocacy, and just general practical supports. So it's kind of hard sometimes to put a kind of a ring around what family carers do. Sometimes it's easier to say what that they don't do. And the answer to that one is not a lot. There's not enough. There's not an awful lot that they don't do. So there's about 500,000 family carers in Ireland, that's estimated from the Irish Health Survey of 2019. If you look at the census figures, that is a little bit different, and we acknowledge that, but we've thought for a long time in the sector that the census figure really wasn't that accurate. There's issues around self-reporting, so we think it's a lot more accurate to use the figure of 500,000, which is estimated from the Irish Health Survey, and that's a lot more in line with what we would see internationally. So that's about a figure of about 1 in 10 of adults have some sort of family caring responsibility, and that kind of is pretty much allied to the US, the UK, Australia, and other kind of equivalent countries that we'd be talking about. The majority do care for a family member. The peak caring age that we're talking about here for family carers is between 40 to 55. So it's that kind of what is also known as the idea of possibly a sandwich carer, and by that they're kind of sandwiched in the middle of the generation. So they may be caring upwards for a family member in an older generation, but then also have caring responsibilities and family responsibilities perhaps for their own children. The average amount of hours is about 35 hours a week that is provided by family carers. So that's kind of your standard working week. There are approximately 60,000, we believe, young carers. That's carers under the age of about 25. But a third of all carers do work in full-time paid employment. So that's just to give you a little bit, I suppose, of context there. Talking about the financial impacts of caring, there are additional costs due to caring, and we have to acknowledge that, and that's come out quite clearly in a lot of the research that's done nationally and internationally. So you have things like needing specific equipment in order to carry out those caring roles, specifically around medical equipment. You will have then increased utilities bills. So for example, if the person you care for needs a nebulizer or an oxygen machine running 24 hours a day, that's obviously going to drive up your your utilities bills. Likewise with heating, somebody may need the heating on a lot more. They might need the air conditioning on a lot more. Less likely in Ireland, but you never know. There might also be specific and additional transport costs, for example, if they need an adapted vehicle, or if they just need more transport to get to various hospital appointments, day services, all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, carers consistently before COVID have always consistently reported heightened financial anxiety. So these 4 statistics that are on your screen actually in the second part come from a piece of research that was done by our colleagues in Family Carers Ireland. And they work directly with family carers. In Care Alliance, what we do is we're an umbrella organization. So we support other organizations that directly support family carers. It sounds a little bit complex, but it's actually makes a lot of sense because we can focus on the research, the policy, all that side of things, so that our members who perhaps aren't necessarily supporting family carers as the main part of their role can really put all of their efforts towards the frontline services that they provide. So, but our colleagues in Family Carers Ireland did a piece of research last year that you can read. It's kind of like the state of caring in Ireland. And within that 70%, this was done pre-COVID, 70% of Irish carers find it hard to make ends meet. 57% experience debt because of the financial impacts of caring. 56% believe that the financial impacts of caring are affecting their own health, whether that be mental health or physical health or emotional health. And 29% of all family carers are living in households with access to less than 20,000 euros per annum. So if you then take that and look at the previous point, which is the additional costs due to caring, you can see that that's a recipe for quite a lot of inequality and lack of access to various other services and supports that might be available due to cost reasons. And I wanted to quickly mention that at the moment, there is currently running by the Department of Social Protection a cost of disability review. I believe, as far as I remember, again, time has no meaning in COVID. I could be talking about something that happened 2 years ago or 2 days ago, but I believe it was 2019. It may have been 2018. Then Minister for Social Protection committed to creating a cost of disability review, which is something that myself and within the family caring kind of community, but also our colleagues across the disability sector have been asking for a long time. And in that, she specifically did commit to a cost of disability and caring review. Unfortunately, over time, that's been diluted, and even kind of going back and forth with the department and the researchers that are undertaking this review on behalf of the department, it is now purely a cost of disability review. The idea is that, or the thought from the department is that the costs of caring will be captured somehow within the additional costs of disability, which I don't feel is the case. However, I just wanted to highlight it here as a piece of research that is probably really relevant to what we're talking about tonight that's upcoming. So moving on to some of the financial implications of caring within COVID times, which I think is relevant here. There was really, everybody kind of had an increased reliance of delivery services. Really, when you think about back to the start of the pandemic, there was very difficult to get into grocery shops. It was very difficult to get access to food, to essentials. And for family carers, very often they were caring for someone who was extremely medically vulnerable, far and above, members of the general population. And so those services that, like deliveries and things like that they were relying on previously were completely curtailed because everybody else was jumping on to get those delivery slots. Many family carers do rely on discount stores, for example, to shop, and those weren't available, simply just weren't available in many phases of the lockdown. So what we saw then was family carers having to eat into savings just for day-to-day costs, because their normal budgeting techniques weren't available to them throughout the entire situation. Added on to that, a lot of family carers had to source their own PPE and medical supplies throughout the entire situation due to shortages. Family carers weren't really being supplied with PPE in the beginning, which was a source of huge anxiety, but also then additional financial burden. And then we had increased costs because people were at home more and day services were shut. So lots more things had to be bought in to keep people occupied during the day when they weren't being able to access day services, for example. So going on to income supports and looking at the kind of the welfare system that's available for family carers, you really have three that I wanted to highlight. You have carers allowance, which is a means tested payment. You must be providing full-time care to access this payment. It's €200 per week. You then have the care support grant, which is not means tested and payable to all full-time family carers. So if you will automatically get paid it if you get carers allowance, but you can also, if you get declined for carers allowance due to means reasons, then you can then apply for it, and you will get that as a kind of a lump payment in June. And then you also have the domiciliary care allowance, or the DCA, which is again a non-means tested payment for a severely disabled child who is under the age 16 and needs kind of extra care and support far beyond, which is the terminology, what is required by a child of the same age, and that's €309 per month. And there's a couple of points I just wanted to highlight here, that if you were to pay an hourly wage to all the family carers in Ireland for the care that they provide, so if you tot all that up and then pay the kind of what you might pay to a bought-in care assistant, the cost would be around about €20 billion per year to the exchequer or to society. So that just kind of highlights just how much money that family carers are actually saving versus how much they actually receive on the kind of the welfare slice of the pie, I guess. Carers allowance is the only social welfare payment to require that you have to be working full-time to be eligible. So you have to be a full-time carer in order to be eligible to receive carers allowance, but you're not guaranteed it because it's means tested. So if your partner, or if you have some other income coming in, then you may not get it even though you're working full-time, pretty much in service. And some people would say in service to the state, although you could debate that terminology. Consistently, we hear back from family carers that the income disregard, so how much you can earn before that's disregarded before your means are tested for the means test, are consistently raised by carers as huge issues. But it is worth noting that Ireland actually has relatively high levels of welfare support for carers in a formalised way. If you remember back, the current rate is €219 a week. In the UK, that's £67 per week. And I actually just double checked today, and there's a huge number of European countries that don't have any formalised welfare support for family carers. However, if you compare us to the UK, we may have a higher weekly payment rate, but our access to services and allied supports is much, much lower. Moving on a little bit to talk about stigma, I just kind of wanted to highlight the kind of the double-edged sword I think that sometimes comes up against for family carers when you're talking about being part of the welfare system. So you kind of have those ideas of, oh, I could never do that. Family carers are amazing. You do amazing work. And the terminology that aggravates me the most, and quite a lot of I think family carers as well, is that kind of terminology of whether the backbone of society, the backbone of care. The National Care Strategy, for example, says family carers should be viewed as partners in care. And yet you also get the opposite narrative, which is, well, it'd be nice to be able to sit at home all day. It's not a job, it's a jolly. And, I wish I could get paid just to talk to my mum. I don't think it's necessarily understood exactly the levels of care and the level of work that goes into being a family carer. It's not just about sitting at home and knitting with your mum at all. It can be quite draining and quite grueling. I did just wanted to briefly flash up here that I did write a paper, just as a shameless plug, on stigma and family care. If anybody is more interested in reading about that in a bit more detail, I talk about it a little bit more, particularly around different types of stigma and different types of care. So that was a really very fast whistle stop, kind of, I threw a lot at people, but that's the contact details if anybody wants to get in contact with me or anything like that. And I shall hand it back to the facilitator.
Zoe, thank you very much for that. And I might just remind everybody, if you have questions for Zoe or any of our panelists, hopefully Zoe, you'll come back to us in a few minutes for a couple of questions. I might just throw one your way, if you wouldn't mind, before we move on. Yeah. Is there, from a political party point of view and a policy development point of view, is Is there an example that we could look towards of a country that gets it right? Because I think some of what you're saying today is a shocking indictment, I suppose, of a failure. Is there somewhere that we could look to say, okay, well, this works well? Or
you see, there's elements of it in lots of different countries get bits of it right. I don't know that there's one that we could go, that's really good. I mean, I hate to be, stereotypical, but a lot of, you do look to some of the Nordic countries for guidance on a lot of things, particularly around welfare, but it's not, they're organized in a very different way. The idea of what the terminology is very often informal care as opposed to family care. So from that kind of terminology, you can see that it's not necessarily formalized in any way. Scotland, for example, has really great supports for family carers, particularly young family carers, policy-wise, but obviously their rates are set by Westminster, which is quite a low rate, as we've seen, of payment. But then again, with in policy, the UK, there is a statutory right to a carer's assessment of need, which there isn't here, for example, which is hopefully starting to be brought into the conversation, but it's not a statutory requirement. So there's kind of, everywhere does it slightly differently, and some countries will have a much more of a focus on actually community residential care as opposed to care in the family, and a lot of it stems back to the kind of the social fabric and how society itself is kind of organized and has been historically. So which I won't jabber on about. There'll be much more qualified people than me to talk about that, I'm sure, this evening. So
thank you so much for your presentation and sharing your insights.
No problem.
It's been the perfect way to start this evening. So thank you very much.
No problem.
What we're going to do now is move on to our sign is the head of policy and PR from the Irish National Organisation for the Unemployed. The organisation plays a key role, and Breed plays a key role in formulating and developing INOU policy on unemployment, social welfare, and the development of an inclusive and equitable labour market. On behalf of the INOU, Breed works with colleagues in the community and voluntary sector on issues of socio-economic justice and is one of the community and voluntary pillar representatives on the National Economic and Social Council. Breed was appointed to the Council of the Economics and Social Research Institute in September 2012 and represents the INOU in social partnership and other structures. Breed, you're very, very welcome to this evening. I will give you the microphone.
Thank you very much, Aidan. Not sure you got the bio up. It's a little out of date, but we won't worry about it.
I was thinking that, but I did pull it off the website.
Yeah. I was thinking, oh, that sounds like something I thought we'd updated, but anyway. So thank you very much. I'm not going to, folks, I haven't done a formal presentation because when I was speaking to your colleagues, they were talking about it being more about people's experiences, and I was concerned if I started to do a PowerPoint, I'd be in policy land before I could stop myself. So what I'm going to do is we had our annual delegate conference last week, and we have two ways in which our membership people can join the organisation. One is through our affiliates. They will be organisations, they could be operating at a national level or a local level. They could be operating on particular issues, be it around migrants, travellers, or they could be working in local development. They could be operating, say, in the provision of employment services and other supports, be community organisations. And then also we have our individual membership, which is how people who are unemployed, they could be in receipt of a payment or none. They could be in receipt of a different working age payment, but they identify with themselves as being unemployed and they wish to do work on the issue. And then through that membership, people can become involved in the running of the organisation through the general branch. The general branch would have representatives on our National Executive Committee, and there's usually a member of the branch is also on the officers' board of the organisation. So at our conference last week, one of the motions to the conference came from the general branch. And what the motion says is the INOU calls on the government to increase social welfare payments in the context of the tacit acknowledgement by government with the introduction of the COVID-19 pandemic unemployment payment that these rates are too low. So it really struck us last year when the crisis hit. The existing system was seen as inadequate for the challenge that presented when we were hit with a health pandemic. think it's important for people to remember in the last crisis, initially payments went up, then they were cut. The duration for the social insurance payment job seekers benefit was cut by 6 months. That cut in duration has not been restored. So if they had left the system as was, anybody who would have gone on JB would have found themselves after 6 months if they'd worked for less than 5 years, 9 months if they'd worked for more than 5 years, off a payment. In the last crisis, a lot of the single biggest reason initially for the live register coming down were people not making the transition from the social insurance payment job seekers benefit to the means tested payment job seekers allowance. In that circumstance, if you're a young person and you're living at home, your parents' income is taken into account. If you're older and have a partner, their income is taken into account. Your partner might not have an exciting job, but it is enough to put you over the limit. In that crisis, the means test wasn't a new one, and that means test hasn't changed. It's been the same now for a couple of decades. So one of the concerns we would have is that as we move out of this crisis, and if people do not make their way back to work, and particularly the job they had initially, if that does not rematerialize and they find it difficult to find employment, some people might indeed have built up an entitlement to job seekers benefit. Others may not. Particularly maybe some young people may not. They may not have been working long enough. People might find it difficult to get the means tested payment job seekers allowance because it's fairly tight and hasn't been updated in many years. We also know through our Welfare Rights Service that some people, their life has changed over the past year. Quite a number of people might have acquired a disability or an illness. Others might find their family circumstances have changed and that they are now in a caring position. So people are starting to look at, well, what other payment could I apply for if I have not been successful, if my job has not really materialized, I cannot find employment. So for some people, it could be a job seekers payment, others it could be a different working age payment, and in some cases it might be no payment at all. And one of the downsides now with the fact that employment and other supports for people who are unemployed, since it's moved in under the Department of Social Protection more than a decade ago, they have very much tied the service to a payment. They keep assuring us, no, it's not tied to a payment, people can walk in the door, but we just know from the experience that people have, that seems to vary a lot around the country. Some services like the local employment service does facilitate a walk-in service. Intro, we're told, does, but we've found that's quite hit and miss. So again, if you end up with no payment, that could prove to be a challenge. So there's been quite a bit of discussion around no cliff edge. The existing system has cliff edges, sharp edges all over the place. And so that is something that needs to be borne in mind. They are talking about winding down the pandemic unemployment payment, but for some people, the way they're doing it is going to be a drop in income for people, and that's going to be difficult to manage. But if people end up on the existing system, they could find that the drop is even more significant, because that is often the experience of people who are unemployed. They come to the end of their JB, their family circumstances is such that they find themselves on a must reduce payment or none at all, depending on their own personal circumstances as well. And then they find themselves outside of the system with few supports, maybe at the time when they most need them. So that is one of the issues that we need to address as we go forward. Another one is in work that the CSO does around equality. Even though we do not have at the moment a socioeconomic ground in our equality legislation, because they capture people's principal economic status, that's how people define themselves, they capture unemployment because they use the data from the Labour Force Survey. And one of the features around access to employment, one of the barriers that comes up, it's usually the first or second barrier, is having been unemployed. So there are issues there in our labour market in trying to move from being unemployed into employment, and that becomes more more stark the longer somebody is unemployed. And then very often people's other personal and family and communal experiences and realities come into effect. So if somebody has a disability, that can be an issue. If somebody comes from particular communities, that can be an issue. When you look at the employment and unemployment rates for communities like travellers, they are in stark contrast to the wider community. When you look at the employment and unemployment rates for people with disability, they were also in stark contrast. So we have significant challenges in our labour market, and we must address those as we move forward. You know, we're talking about an economic recovery. That will not be inclusive if we don't address some of these challenges. Also, the pandemic unemployment payment, like the conditionality around it was far less than in comparison to a job seekers payment. Now, for people who've never experienced a job seekers payment sizes, they're probably not aware of that. But that is one of the things, again, that we just feel that move from one to the other. And particularly, like on a job seekers payment, genuinely seeking work applies. It also applied for PUP, but during the pandemic, because of the lockdowns we went through, some of that was put on hold. When we move out of the lockdowns, the economic recovery, if it holds, that will start to be applied. And I think that again could prove to be quite a negative experience for people. And we would like to see the employment services that people receive been really supportive of people, really trying to work with people, trying to find the best option for people. If somebody needs to reskill, that's the option they're given. If people are looking for work and just need support, maybe have worked in a particular area, that's gone. That support way to look at, well, what's your experience? What are your skills? How could you transfer them? What are the options out there? Is there a better option out there for you? That a really supportive service is what, you know, we would like to see been available to people. And we will be concerned just around how genuinely seeking work is often applied. Initially, when somebody is newly unemployed, often, you know, the system acknowledges, oh yes, people trying to get back to the type of work they had. The longer you're unemployed, they then expect you to take whatever job is going. And that can be for people if they're hoping to get employed in one area and what's available is something very different, maybe precarious, low income. There are all of those challenges there that are facing people. And so we really need to ensure that we are creating a system that is supportive of people, that addresses the stigma that is attached with being unemployed. And we, you know, that's one of the concerns that we've had within the organization over the past year, that there's that message has gone out that, you know, I mean, one of the phrases over the past year that has had me hopping mad on occasions is through no fault of their own. People need to realize that if the system sees you have become unemployed through your own fault, or you've gone on a welfare holiday, they will say no payment. So when people are unemployed, it's because they have no choice, or little or no choice, or they've lost their job and they're trying to get their head around that. And so it's really important that we have a system that is supportive of people, that we lift existing welfare payments up to a level that moves people out of poverty and supports them to meet a minimal essential standard of living, and that we provide people with good supports to be able to find a decent job. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Breeze. Thanks very much for that. That was, again, really insightful, and thanks so much for sharing it. I might, again, hang on to you. The questions are starting to really come in now, so I might throw a couple at you now, and then again, maybe if we've time at the end, if that's okay. You spoke about the motion that went before the Congress. Was there a number said about that in the motion in terms of what the figure would be in terms of the unemployment payment, firstly?
Sure. Well, we would very much work with the Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice around the work that they've done around a minimal essential standard of living. And so welfare rates are sort of, when you look at that, they're about 20 or 30 euros below where they would need to be for a single person. Now we know we're not going to get an increase of that nature. So we would be looking for in and around 10 euros in the coming budget, to try and move towards that, because we know it'll take a few budgets. invariably we're told, oh, we couldn't be doing things like that. Your welfare payments are so generous, your people can't get back to work. That, you know, and it's often struck, I mean, this whole thing of employers saying we can't get people to get back to work, there's nothing new in that one. I sometimes wonder, how come all employers seem to manage, because often the example they give is somebody maybe used children on rent supplement, and they always include child benefit in the mix. And, you know, you're talking then maybe about less than 5% of the live register, thinking, how do they manage all of them to find the one person to offer the job to? So again, just there's that narrative around welfare is too generous. It isn't. Anybody trying to manage on it, if it is your only source of income, over time it wears you down. And then just that chance to be able to manage and survive is so difficult. And then to try and look for work when you're trying to struggle to survive is so difficult.
And if I was to ask you then, if we took that the next step in terms of what would be the number one priority then in supporting, I suppose, a more dignified welfare system for people, what would be the first priority that would be on top of your list? Kind of finances wise aside, how about the system? Because we know that there's challenges to SICAP, for example, or other different services. So what would be your number one priority?
Our number one is that the department stands by its own objective of providing services that are built around the person, and that they really work with where the person is, not where they would like them to be, and that they really try to ensure that they're giving people the best advice and support. So for some people, it is possibly just helping them to do a CV, how to present yourself at an interview. For others, it is really a case of, it's a longer journey. And also, they may be coming from a background where there's significant discrimination. And so we need the state also stepping up and willing to challenge that and willing to support people to be able to access employment. So a person-centered public employment service that really has equality and includes, really trying to support people to be able to improve their circumstances.
Thank you so much, Breed. Hopefully you'll come back in a couple of minutes and we'll have a couple of more bits of a discussion. But for now, thank you so much. Our third speaker for this evening, I hope everyone's doing okay so far. Our third speaker is Dr. Joe Whelan. Joe, if you're there, I'm really conscious that I don't want to be misdescribing people after getting it so wrong with Breed. So if you're there and you'd like to come on and maybe just give a couple of sentences yourself to introduce yourself, that might be way more effective than me mislabeling you and telling you something that you might have done before.
Okay, can you hear me, Aidan?
I can indeed, Joe, yeah.
Okay, I'm just trying to get the video going now. Okay, so I'd say the only way that you were probably likely to misrepresent me is that the picture that you have of me, I have a beard in the picture and I've since been shorn. So aside from that, I think you probably would have been okay. But yeah, my name's Joe Whelan and I'm a lecturer in the School of Applied Social Studies in University College Cork. And I suppose my broad research interests are in welfare and the welfare state, particularly kind of critical political economy and lived experiences therein. So I've done a bit of research, a bit of work and published a little bit about people's lived experiences of receiving welfare. And this would have been very much pre-COVID, kind of post-crisis. And I think I'm going to kind of maybe talk a little bit about that today, just to kind of contextualize the discussion around the PUP and the cliff edge that we're approaching. So I'm not sure if I did a better job than you there, Ed.
Definitely, I've scribbled out all my notes. Thank you very much.
So I am going to rely on PowerPoint. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you and I'm going to talk through that if that's okay. So I'm hopeful that you can see that on the screen there now. So Ed, you might just let me know if that's after coming up on the screen because
I can see that, Joe. Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, brilliant. So I suppose first and foremost, just to thank Zoe and Breed for two really interesting papers, and to thank the webinar organizers also for the invitation. It's always great to be able to maybe talk about these kinds of ideas to broader audiences. So I really do appreciate the invitation. So I am going to talk about the PUP towards the end of the presentation, but I want to kind of contextualize it first And I was really kind of struck by the title of the webinar, so Challenging the Narrative, Overcoming Stigma and Inequality. So I am going to talk a little bit about stigma, and I am going to talk a little bit about the general narrative around welfare recipiency, but perhaps how that was a little bit different in respect to the pandemic unemployment payment. So I suppose what I'm proposing is that the stigma of public burden, which often attaches to welfare recipiency, has been something that has fluctuated with respect to the pandemic unemployment payment. So I'll be picking up on many of the themes that Breed has already introduced, and indeed entering some of the same territory. So if people want to get in touch with me, please do feel free to do so. If you're interested in anything that I've written, you sometimes find that these things are lodged behind the paywall. So if you are interested in anything I've written and you want a copy of it, please do contact me by email. And you can also find me on Twitter, and I'd be happy to send on anything I've written that you're interested in, or indeed to follow up on any of the themes that I discuss. So I just want to contextualize everything briefly by talking about the fact that welfare stigma is not new. It's actually very much a historical phenomenon. And then I'm going to look at the kind of post-crisis, pre-COVID era, so post-2008 up until COVID happened, and what lived experiences of receiving welfare were like for people during that time, and the kind of narratives that kind of surrounded welfare recipiency during those years. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the PUP and this kind of impending cliff edge, which we've heard so much about in recent weeks. And so before I do any of that, I suppose I want to maybe unpack what we mean by stigma. So we're all talking about stigma, and I think it's a word that somewhat rolls off the tongue. We have a sort of an inherent or intrinsic understanding of what it is, but what does it actually mean to be somebody that's experiencing stigma, to be somebody that has been stigmatized? So I think if you were interested in the concept at all, you will have encountered the work of Irving Goffman, particularly his work, Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity. So it's an old text, and Goffman, I suppose, describes stigma in a particular way. But effectively, what I want people maybe to hold on to is the idea that to be stigmatized or treated differently because of a perceived undesirable characteristic. And the word perceived here is important because stigma is something that's fluid. It's a social structure, and as such, it has a fluid dynamic. And different things are stigmatized at different times. So even if we think through our own history, different social conditions have been very much stigmatized at different times. And the PUP is really interesting in this respect. It's almost like a case study at kind of watching how stigma fluctuates in line with how the pandemic has progressed. And I'll pick that back up again later on. So when we're thinking about stigma, then we're thinking about somebody being treated differently because of a perceived undesirable characteristic, in this case, receiving welfare. So, you know, welfare stigma has always been with us. So as long as there has been forms of welfare, there has been forms of welfare stigma. If we were to go back to before the introduction of any type of formal welfare, indeed to when welfare was mostly handled through a charitable mix, we will have found that there were narratives of who deserved support and who didn't even then. Formal welfare supports, which were introduced through the poor laws and through things like less eligibility, pretty much institutionalized the idea of stigma. So I draw here on Spicker, who talks about how the stigma of the poor law was something that was legendary. It effectively was a policy intended to deter people from seeking relief. And at the very least, if it was unable to deter them, if they had to fall back on the poor law for relief, it would mark them off from normal members of society. So again, it's this characteristic that marks you out for different treatment within your society. And this is something that's endemic and indeed inherent in how welfare has been done, particularly in the Anglosphere, particularly in the global north. So when we think about contemporary welfare stigma, then we're really using the same type of logic, but the processes are different. So we can still think about policies to deter, policies to mark people out, but of course people don't enter the workhouse now in the way that they would have done under the poor law. And we can break contemporary stigma down into three particular and distinct overlapping areas. And I'm drawing here on the work of a UK scholar, Professor Ben Bamberg. And he talks about three different types of stigma in respect to welfare. So firstly, he talks about claim stigma. So this is very simply the stigma that arises during the process of actually claiming a benefit, welfare entitlement. And then subsequently, when you're maintaining that claim after you've been awarded your payment, continuing to maintain that claim, that can also be a deeply stigmatizing process. He's also identified stigmatization. So this is the perception in the first instance that others will devalue your identity because you're someone receiving welfare. But it's also the experience of being devalued. So if you've ever been in receipt of welfare and you've ever had a conversation with somebody about that and they've devalued your identity or passed a remark that was hurtful, well, then you've experienced stigmatization in respect to welfare recipiency. And of course, then this has knock-on effects. And this brings us to personal stigma. So this is, again, a person's own sense that claiming benefits conveys a devalued identity. If society is telling us that it's wrong to claim benefits, then when you are claiming benefits, you're going to be personally stigmatized. It's going to have an effect on your own identity, on your self-esteem, on your personhood, and so on. So when people enter the geography of the welfare state now to initiate a claim, there are very many different ways in which stigma becomes manifest through their lived experience. Why stigma and welfare, and why stigma in welfare? It's a kind of a paradox when we think about it. Welfare is something that should be positive, something that we should think about in positive terms, something that we would wish people to have, generally speaking. How does it become stigmatized? What happens to make such a kind of a noble undertaking in the form of providing for people at times when they need it? How does that become something that's stigmatized? Well, drawing on the work of Pinker here, he talks about the imposition of stigma as a form of symbolic violence. So the idea that if we have to do welfare, we do welfare, but we stigmatize the doing of welfare in order to deter those that would seek it. So as a form of symbolic violence, that this is almost built into the types of policies that we have. Spicker then talks about the fact that stigma arises both because of the benefit system itself, which is often humiliating and degrading, but also because oftentimes people that are entering the geography of the welfare state are already stigmatized groups. They may already be poor and have experienced the stigma of poverty. They may be parenting alone. They may have a disability. They may be unemployed, and so on. So we see a kind of intersectional analysis of stigma here in Spicker's work. So I want to draw your attention now to Titmuss, and in particular to his use of the term stigma of public burden, because that's going to become important later on when I'm talking a little bit about the PUP. And Titmuss is a real kind of key figure in terms of post-war scholarship, somebody with a real social democratic vision of the good society and what welfare could potentially mean. And he's taking aim squarely here at the idea of means testing. And he says that if all services are provided, irrespective of whether they represent benefits, amenities, social protection, or compensation on a discriminatory means-tested basis, do we not foster the sense of failure and the stigma of public burden? The fundamental objective of all such tests of eligibility is to keep people out, not to let them in. And I think that's what's really been interesting about the PUP, as Breed alluded to earlier. The same levels of conditionality didn't attach to the PUP. And because of that, the stigma of public burden, at least initially, seemed to be much less than what you would have encountered with your traditional or post or pre-COVID rather welfare payments. So this is just some data from some of the work that I've done myself, and these are two people talking about their experiences of receiving welfare pre-COVID, so in the post-crisis period. And you can see here that there's very much the stigma of public burden in the words that they speak. So Martin talks about experiencing an obvious stigma through being involved with the welfare system. And this is particularly true in his interactions with the labour market. Clive talks about, I suppose, kind of a common sense narrative. The idea that, you know, people have never worked a day in their life, and why would they? Because they're on welfare. The idea that it's something that people are doing in a kind of effectless manner. And this is very much kind of discourse from below, but some of the phrases that Clive uses here are recognizable at the upper echelons of political discourse. So the idea of people never working a day in their life and so on. We hear things that are very, very similar coming from the mouths of, you know, mainstream and established politicians when they talk about people who are receiving welfare and so on. So how do we police welfare then? If it's a stigmatized gift, if it's something that we want to deter people from seeking, if at all possible, and when they do seek it, if we want them not to have the most comfortable experience, how do we police it? So we police the welfare subject effectively through welfare conditionality. And welfare conditionality is something that links eligibility to specified or compulsory responsibilities or particular patterns of behavior. So in the first instance, it's the conditions you have to satisfy to be deemed appropriate to enter a particular payment. In the second instance, it's the places you have to go and the things you have to do in order to continue to maintain that placement. So we police welfare very tightly. It's scrutinized very heavily. And the Irish welfare system, didn't begin that way. Arguably, it changed from being a predominantly passive system, which focused on things like job creation, education, training, to in the post-crisis period becoming a much more active and punitive system, which focused on labour market activation and sanctioning. A change in tone was accompanied by a change in welfare infrastructure and aesthetic redesign through the launch of Intrio, and of course, policy direction through things like pathways to work, which were very much based around the idea of activating people so that they could engage in the labour market as quickly as possible when and if they sought a welfare payment in a time of crisis or unemployment. So what about welfare in the time of the pandemic then? So I've kind of said welfare in the time of plague here. I think I'm going for a more literary reference than perhaps I'm able to kind of pull off. But, something amazing happened with the onset of the pandemic in that all of a sudden, and this was true of other jurisdictions as well as Ireland, the social contract was being rewritten virtually overnight. And the social safety net suddenly expanded, and all these things that we thought were never possible suddenly became possible. In Ireland in particular, we saw the introduction of the pandemic unemployment payment for those whose employment had been disrupted by the crisis. And amazingly, welfare, which we've just spent some time looking at and we've seen has been very much a stigma of social altruism, was welcomed, even demanded in the Irish context. And the value then of a strong social safety net in the form of a universal welfare provision seemed to be recognised. And the social stigma that we've just spent some time talking about was nowhere to be seen, at least initially. So I think early on there was a sense that this was, brimming with Beveridgean promise, that there was an opportunity to establish the value of a functioning welfare system in the public consciousness, and maybe foster a kind of a positive vision, a positive welfare imaginary, that people would maybe think of welfare as something positive. Welfare is a word that has become imbued with a sense of negativity, but to move beyond that and to move back to what welfare and the idea of a welfare commons could and should be. And we seem to have that, at least very early on, with the introduction of the PUP. So what was different about the PUP then that kind of worked, and what was different about it that allowed us to maybe have that sense of hope at the outset? Well, as Breed alluded to earlier, reasonable ease of access. If you needed it, you could get it. And it worked. It helped people that needed help at a time that they needed help. But the key thing I think that made the PUP different was that it was an entirely new payment. So this was something entirely new. The Irish government created something new. This wasn't the case in other jurisdictions. So in the UK, for example, the increase in unemployment was very much managed within the existing welfare infrastructure through universal credit. There were marginal rate increases, but by and large, they managed the crisis through their existing welfare infrastructure. And of course, then this is very much easier to roll back because there's not a whole lot to roll back. In Ireland, we created what I've termed a social policy leviathan. So we created this monster that the government really didn't know what to do with after a time. And you could see that because it's proved very difficult to realign with existing welfare infrastructure. So things that were of note then over the lifetime of the PUP. So the introduction of the PUP saw the creation of a two-tier welfare system, and Breed has also alluded to this. And again, this saw the tacit favouring of the worker. So if you were exiting work through no fault of your own, to use that horrible phrase, because of COVID, you were seen as productive and into more. However, if you were a traditional welfare recipient, you were very much viewed as being unproductive, and you would continue to receive your €203 per week. All new entrants to the PUP payment scheme would initially receive €350, as we know. Now, of course, this was eventually adjusted and linked €250. And, you know, this was accessible. This was done without means testing and so on. Of course, there have been several dates since almost the day it was introduced. There's been talk about how we're going to wrap it up, and there have been lots of dates which have come and gone in terms of wrapping it up because of the way the crisis has developed. But there is now a strategy in place to unravel the PUP and to effectively fold it into pre-COVID welfare infrastructure. So this will mean an eventual cliff edge, and I've said it 3 times here: a cliff edge is a cliff edge is a cliff edge. And it does not matter how long the road to the cliff is, or if there are steps along the way, eventually you get to the edge of the cliff and eventually you walk off it. So no matter what way you dress it up, or no matter what kind of way you try to explain it, it's a cliff edge, and eventually people will walk off the cliff. So stigma and the PUP then, and this is where I finish up. So with the pandemic unemployment payment, the stigma of public burden has tended to fluctuate. It was initially seen as a solidarity payment, so people really got behind the idea of this payment. The discourse of deserving it wasn't really that far off, and it soon crept into the mix. And of course, there were suggestions that people earning below 350 shouldn't be getting 350. Those who were in part-time work came in for censure, and so on. And individual employers as well as employer groups criticised the PUP for creating a disincentive effect by being overly generous. So particular groups have tended to come in for censure, mostly those in the service industry and younger people, particularly students. And this is very interesting. Negative sentiment has tended to increase during times of opening up and did decrease during strict lockdown. So when we were locked in conditions, there was very little to be said about people receiving the PUP. But as soon as opening up happens, suddenly the discourse changes and the public of stigma of public burden increases. So we can see that as the PUP has kind of developed and as the crisis has kind of ebbed and flowed, the stigma of public burden has fluctuated. So here's just an example of this, and this is a recent tweet from somebody who advocates for restaurants, gastropubs and cafes. Now, I haven't named the person, I don't intend to personalize it, and also, you know, I think I don't want to risk being normative. I think people do very much hold these kinds of views. So, you know, the idea that why is Ireland paying PUP payments to sectors fully reopened, and then the idea of why are we paying PUP to people who are apparently refusing to return to work. So this is the discourse that is emerging now as the reopening happens. So again, we see that the stigma of public burden fluctuates. Interestingly here, the burden is not placed on low wages, but rather on an overly generous welfare system, which apparently allows people to refuse to return to work. And this type of narrative effectively then becomes the justification for a cliff edge. So a cliff edge, and this is my last slide, the top rate of PUP will be reduced from 350 to 300 in September. Again, this is predicated on the idea of progress reopening. 2 further phases then will follow. So the payment will reduce to 250 in November and be abolished in February. And at this point, those who are continue to be unemployed will revert to claiming unemployment benefits. If this comes to pass, it will mean that the PUP, a social policy leviathan, which seemed to be beyond the control of the government at one point, will have successfully been slain, and the welfare system will have effectively been realigned. Unemployed welfare recipients will receive €203. So I suppose the question I'd like to finish with then, is this a cliff edge to poverty? Well, in 2019, the minimum disposable income needed for a single adult to stay above the poverty line stood at €252, which is well above the 203, which people are going to find themselves receiving if and when the PUP is eventually wrapped up. So, you know, I think that speaks for itself. So those are the sources I was drawing on. That's my presentation. I hope that you found it useful, and I'm going to hand back over now, and I welcome any questions that you might have. So I just want to try to stop sharing my screen if I can get the technology to work for me.
I have to say I'm particularly struck. It was a really insightful presentation, John. Thank you very much. But that last slide, I think, says it all, and especially when you say a cliff edge is a cliff edge is a cliff edge, no matter how long the road. I think that's something I'm certainly going to take from this evening. If I could just ask you before we bring the other panelists back in, Joe, and again, to really stress our thanks for you coming along to share this evening. When you talk about stigma, and I seen you kind of allude to like the young people there, for example, who potentially are already stigmatized based on their age and other factors, and so that we could see maybe layers of stigma being attached to different maybe demographics within the country. What kind of tangible things can we do as a society to challenge stigma or to minimize it?
I think my instinct when you asked the question straight away is the word universality and redistributive justice. So I think when to go back to Titmuss, who was writing in the post-war era, I think when you create policies that are designed to keep people out as opposed to let people in, you create stigma by proxy. When something like welfare is stigmatized, you're stigmatized before you cross the threshold of a welfare office. You're stigmatized proxy. You're stigmatized because it's a stigmatized social good. If we could change that, if we could kind of shift the narrative to kind of draw on the title of this webinar, to begin thinking of welfare as something positive, something that we all pay into so that we can all potentially benefit from, and I think that is a true social democratic vision of what welfare could and should be. That's, I think, what will ameliorate and eventually, hopefully, kind of undo the stigma of public burden, which seems to attach so readily to the idea of receiving welfare. So universality, allowing people in, and not kind of keeping people out. It's not the direction we've been going in recent years. I had some hope that the pandemic might push us in that direction, and of course things like universal basic income were very much back on the agenda. But arguably now, my major worry now is that after a crisis, austerity follows. And I worry now that the kind of the suite of measures that were rolled out during the pandemic will be used as a justification now to impose austerity on people that can ill afford to have austerity imposed on them. I think you're on mute there, Aidan, just to say.
You think I'd have it sussed by now?
The dreaded mute button.
We used to laugh. It's not funny anymore. Thanks, Joe. So we might, Breed and Zoe, if you'd be able to come in before we welcome in Gary Gannon from our parliamentary party. There's a couple of more follow-up questions. And Zoe, I might come to you first if I can. Mm-hmm. We've had someone ask, apart from financial support, what else should the state be doing?
For family carers in particular?
Yeah.
I think some of the core things that we really need to look at is not just about the financial supports, definitely, but it's around the allied supports and services. Because in general, if the person that is being cared for, if the person who's caring knows that they're going to be taken into account when supports and services come back up, so access to respite, home care, the medical needs to be taken care of without a huge amount of hassle. I think that would probably be one of the best things, single best thing, that sort of way, simply because so much of a carer's time very often is so much of it is taken up just by advocating either on their own behalf, but mostly on behalf of the person they care for. And it's just exhausting, just kind of constantly having to make phone calls and follow-up appointments and, X, Y, and Z. And I think that's probably some of the biggest thing is a focus on the supports and services, and then following on from that, then that would unlock, I think, a huge amount of the other issues that are causing problems for family carers.
Thanks, Breed. Zoe, thank you, Zoe.
No worries.
Breed, I'm coming to you next. Breed, we've had another question in then also in terms of housing payments. I think you spoke about that. How does housing payments affect social welfare payments? I have rent increases, for example, affected welfare rates that people are receiving?
And where it's interesting, like in the past year, the system became far more flexible and supportive. So people have had more supports around their housing, but one of the difficulties can be where our housing supports are pitched and where rents are at, there's a challenge. And that can often be a difficulty, and people can find it quite difficult to manage. And a lot of people end up paying, even though they get housing supports, they are still paying out of their welfare payment to actually meet their housing costs. And that can leave people in very difficult circumstances. So it is a huge issue for people, yeah, and affordability is massive.
Thank you, Reid. Joe, we've had one for you. Does the system apply the same level of stigma to people with disabilities?
That's an interesting question. I suppose traditionally, maybe less so, but I think in recent years, particularly in the post-crisis or the post-financial crisis years, more and more stigma has been applied to people who would have been receiving a disability type payment because they're not able to work due to illness, injury, and so on. So, you know, there has been a kind of, you know, deservingness as something that is measurable has tended to kind of attach to groups like, so let's say someone receiving an old age pension is generally seen as being deserving. Sometimes people that are receiving a disability type payment due to an obvious disability are seen as deserving. Somebody that's not working and receiving a welfare payment generally comes in for the most stigma, or perhaps maybe one-parent family payment recipients would also be a very deeply stigmatized category. So in the past, it comes down to this idea of deservingness. Who deserves to get what, and what should they have to do in order to get it? So if you're seen as being deserving, well, then the stigma doesn't attach in the same degree. And so disability is a tricky one. It kind of tends to depend on the nature of the disability. We would see in kind of popular and political discourses, but particularly popular discourses, tabloid type discourses, there's a sense that some people are not really disabled and are kind of, you know, milking the system. And these narratives circulate in society then and question the deservingness of people that are receiving disability type payments. And of course, that's a deeply stigmatizing narrative and undoubtedly very, very much felt by people that are receiving disability payments. So, you know, it's not an either or an and or. It can, you know, be very kind of dependent on specific circumstances and so on. But I would say generally, if I had to give a general answer, the level of stigma that attaches to disability type payments has increased as welfare system has become more about activation, more punitive and more about sanctioning. That would be my view of it, certainly.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. I think we have one last one in that I think might be a good way to wrap this up, and I'd like to hear from all of you if you could. So please feel free to go as you like. What would your call for action be to political parties or representative groups in order to see change? Baby steps, big steps. What would your call to action be? And I'd open that to anybody who'd like to come up.
We would like to see the inadequacy of existing payments to be addressed seriously. And while I'm at it, while the other two are thinking, the stigma associated with payments to be addressed. And I think providing person-centered services that really are there to help people, supportive of people, services people feel they can call into to get a steer, get advice, that would make a big difference, because that would mean then going in the door of the local intro office would not be seen as been in for a dig. It's somewhere where you go because you need assistance of whatever nature. Thank you.
I think ideologically, I think I certainly would like to see that the platitudes in some way that are often given to family carers to be gotten rid of. By that I mean, you know, for example, last week was National Carers Week. I don't know if people were aware of that. And very often during that time, we hear an awful lot of rhetoric from lots of people about, you know, how carers, again, like I said, are the backbone of society. They do X, Y, and Z. And a lot of the time people kind of know that family carers provide the care because they love the person very often that they're caring for, and there isn't really another option. So they kind of do it because they kind of have to. Lots of people really enjoy it, but in some ways I do think there's almost an expectation that family will step in where the state fails, and I think that ideologically I'd like to see that kind of discussion change a little bit, because most family carers would still do the family caring. They still want to care for the person that they love and their family member at home in their own community. But I think there's almost I don't know, it's kind of a play to emotions, I think, sometimes from the policy heads, if you want to call that way, you know. So, and then in general, I think, you know, following through on the actions that are already in, say, the likes of the National Care Strategy, National Disability Strategy. We have great strategies in Ireland, but we just don't implement them properly. We have fantastic, I think, I remember I had a discussion with Senator Colette Kelleher years ago, and she said we have an implementation deficit disorder in this country. And I thought that was actually quite a nice way of putting it. So, yeah.
So that leaves me, yeah, it's interesting, Breed's comment on the kind of the lack of sight of the individual. I know in my own work, it was something that the people I spoke to found very frustrating, is that they were forced into boxes they didn't necessarily fit, and they came with particular needs and ambitions and goals and dreams, and they were pretty much told, park that, this is what can be offered to you, and people find that deeply, deeply frustrating. So I would echo Breed's call for a more holistic welfare system, but I suppose my call to action would be related, somewhat the other side of the coin. I think political parties need to put poverty back on the agenda. I think poverty has become too big. It's become so big a problem that it's almost a background hum, and we don't pay attention to it in the way that we should. So there's not enough talking about poverty. There's not enough being done about poverty. I don't hear enough political spokespeople talking about poverty. There's still 12.8% of people at risk of poverty in this country now as we speak in 2021. That's not good enough. Nobody should have to live with the indignity of poverty. And I don't care what your ideology is, whether you're left, right, centre or indifferent, nobody should have to live with the indignity of poverty. So I want to hear political parties talking about poverty and developing policies to tackle poverty. I think ever since the Combat Poverty Network kind of was folded into the government, there's been a deficit. We need something that's independent from the state, to be kind of brought back, that's a kind of vehicle for talking about poverty and the impact and effect that that has on people. Because poverty, and research the world over will tell you this, underpins so much of what we would characterize in terms of social problems. If we get the basics right and we give people the dignity of not having to live in poverty, so much else becomes so much easier after that. So my call to action to all political parties, and none, would be start talking about poverty, start thinking about poverty. We need to do something to address it.
Well, thank you again to Zoe and to Breeze and to Joe. I for one feel very privileged to have been able to be here and listen to you all three speak this evening. So I really appreciate it, and thank you very much. What we might do is just to give Gary a chance to get himself in. I might again share our screen and just ask our participants maybe to answer one more question now in light of everything that we've heard this evening. If we can go back to menti.com, and what I'll do is share my screen once again, and hopefully you can see menti.com there. And if you put that code in again, so menti, MENTI.com, and the code is 66751083. And if you click on that, then hopefully you'll see just there, what supports are needed post-pandemic. So feel free to put a word in, a sentence, or a number of sentences there. What supports are needed post-pandemic? And while you're doing that, Gary, I'm going to give you the introduction, and hopefully I get this hopefully I get this right. Gary is our spokesperson in the party on social protection, on education and higher education, along with a number of other briefs. He is a member of the Oireachtas Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence. Gary is also chair of the Parliamentary Party. A former Dublin City Councillor for Cabra and Glasnevin, he was elected as a TD for Dublin Central in February 2020. Born in Dublin's North Inner City, Gary is a fundamental believer in educational equality and continues to be a committed campaigner for educational access, regardless of a person's socio-economic background. Gary, after all we've heard this evening, I'm delighted to welcome you, and hopefully you'll take the stage for as long as you want. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. So let me stop my share, and the floor is yours. Thanks, Gary.
Okay, I think I'm on mute now. Aidan, thanks a million, pal. Firstly, a huge thank you to Zoe, Breed, and Joe. Look, it wasn't only informative. I actually felt your presentations were really, actually, not only inspiring, actually it was more than that. They actually take it through down the gauntlet to anyone involved in politics listening to those presentations. And it's certainly something that I hope to take up. Look, I think in terms of rather giving a huge amount of detail, I actually want to talk to you a little bit about values, and actually the type of values that brought me into politics, but also brought me into the Social Democrats. I think when we talk about social welfare and social protection and basic decency, which encompasses all that, I think it should start with values. So for me, in a real sense, I grew up in Dublin's north inner city, right in the heart of Dublin 1 in Summerhill in a flat complex there. And that's relevant in the sense of kind of where I get my values from and where I get my understanding of how the state imposes a form of structural violence on people, and actually anyone who's getting involved in the system has a responsibility to deconstruct that. And for me, poverty is something that I've seen right from the beginnings of my life in the north inner city. You know, poverty was that which dare not speak its own name. You were surrounded by it, and poverty was all encompassing and attacked the senses. So I've talked to a few people about that since, you know, you could smell poverty. For me, the smell of poverty is kind of the deep fat fryer, because my mum had to cook quick before she went out to her second job of the day. You could hear poverty because the walls are so close to each other. You could feel poverty, feel it in the clothes you wear. You're touching poverty when you're walking up the floor of your flats, and kind of everything. Poverty is all encompassing. It's corrosive to the human condition. And for me, I never really understood it right into the moment where I never really understood it in an academic sense, or being able to step outside it, only for the fact that I got very lucky. Got to go off to university when lots of other people in my own community never got that opportunity. When you got there, you got to take a step back and just say, wow, holy Jesus, like that was wrong and it was inflicted. You know, when you think about kind of my own family's experience, you know, every time my mother tried to take herself out of poverty, you know, with being a street trader or something like that, there's somebody there to arrest her or call her a hawker or something along those lines. You know, it's just making it really massively difficult. You know, thinking about poverty for me is all, even as a kid, is sitting in a politician's waiting room with your mother while she asks and begs for basic provisions that she should otherwise be afforded in any decent republic, be that housing, be a kind of assistance with the social welfare inspectors who are treating the family like dirt. All of those sort of things were kind of really grounding for me, and I suppose it's one of the reasons why I'm passionate about what I do in politics. I'm passionate about the idea of contribution. I suppose why I never understood poverty while you were experiencing it is probably when I got the opportunity to step outside of it and got to go to university and got to kind of see life from a couple of different perspectives. Around 2012, I got to see poverty being inflicted on other people. You know, I'd kind of been a little bit lucky. I got to university, I got the job, I was outside of it, but I was still working in the north in the city in the community development centre there. And you got to see poverty from kind of a slightly different vantage point. And in 2012 and around that period for the next 5 or 6 years, when austerity was inflicted upon this country in the most extreme, harsh and cruel way, you got to see who was targeting that. And austerity had two targets from what I can see. Two really prominent targets. The first was the community development sector, which was attacked and eroded to 37% of its budget, far more than any other sector. You know, community development is the places where people in working class areas learn to read and write, were able to kind of access a bit of community childcare, they were able to get some supports, and that was absolutely stripped away in an intentional, and it was intentional, manner of deconstructing communities and attacking the very decency of people. And then there was a way of kind of scapegoating people, as a way of kind of the state and Fine Gael and whoever they were there with at the time, being able to kind of say, well, look, we're all experiencing poverty, but we're going after these spongers. I honestly feel it was purposeful and it was cruel in terms of what happened to the community development sector. And then there was also the attacks on people who were on social welfare, the unemployed, the underemployed, lone parents, people with disabilities, carers, I'll never forget being in a community development centre in an education facility when the dual payments were removed. The dual payments which enabled persons to get social welfare brought to get their back to education allowance, and seeing kind of how young working class women predominantly were targeted in that way was just extraordinarily harsh. And having to see that person having to risk dropping out of their projects, dropping out of that capacity they had to kind of better their circumstances, it's massively cruel. Seeing the loss of the bereavement grants, seeing the lone parents payments being the age being brought down to 7 before you cut off a lone parents payments, all of that sort of stuff just left me going, what in the name of Jesus sort of republic is this? And that for me was when I wanted to fight back, looking at the people who were punching down. You only ever wanted to fight back and say, well, that's how they're wielding their power and their influence and their mandate they've been given. And I wanted to get involved in politics to strip a little bit of that away from them, because it was going after communities that I'd grown up in and being involved in. And there's any number of examples of looking at how they've continued to punch down over the years. Our very own former and future Taoiseach was brought, kind of built his profile to be Taoiseach and a mandate of welfare cheat us all. And then we very quickly discovered that particular campaign cost more money than anything that was clawed back from welfare cheats themselves. It was just the harshness and fairness of the republic that we are creating, and very clear evidence that the structural violence that we see within the system didn't happen by mistake. It was created, it was placed there. And, I'm just seeing, I've actually wanted to confront to be in policy, be it legislation, hopefully one day, and also just being actually stand there and actually saying, no, you're wrong. Even now, when you look at the idea, when this narrative that's creeping in that people are exploiting the PUP payments, and that's been seeing that somebody who's on $350 a week doesn't want to work because they'll be getting less in the workplace, and seeing that actual weird awful scenario where we're accusing somebody who not wanting to not work in a scenario where they get less than $350, and seeing the person to blame rather than the conditions which create an environment in which somebody is working and earning less than €350 a week. And that's what we're supposed to focus on. I think it's one of the things that we'll always fight back against in the Social Democrats. Even at the times when things were extraordinarily good in this country, were good for some, the boom, I think we had less than 5% unemployment. So going and fighting against that rhetoric is something that we absolutely have to commit ourselves to, saying there's massive unity. And I'm proud to live in a republic where we have some degree of a safety net. Well, actually, I'm just not proud to live where that safety net is below the poverty line. And that has to be the challenge for us. Really does. And there's some things that we have to do over the next coming. There's opportunity coming out of the pandemic, and there's some things that we simply cannot allow ourselves to unsee. We cannot unsee the fact that when everybody was taken away from the workplace, when it was regardless of your postcode or regardless of your family status, when the pandemic stripped away all that we found to be comfort in this country, we initiated a welfare payment of €350 a week, because all of a sudden 203 was seen as being not good enough for others who might be seen as more deserving. I just found that absolutely incredible. And while we can't unsee it, we absolutely just have to fight against it. We talk about what we'd like to achieve in terms of social welfare rates. And I mean, Joe captured it very well, but why don't we strive for a country where nobody lives below the poverty line? And actually see that as something that's realistic. This is not a target that we just simply say and slap ourselves in the back. Bringing people up to €252 and 11 cents above the poverty line should not be seen as an unrealistic expectation. I mean, it's incredible that we have 760,000 people in this country who still live in poverty, and that's 1 in 6 people. And we see that as being acceptable. I think any sort of social democratic pursuit of governance should have at its very core the elimination of poverty. My first Dáil speech, I mentioned the elimination of poverty as their only destination in terms of a goal that we should be aiming to achieve. And it's something that we'll continue to work for as long as we exist. It absolutely has to be. I mean, I see the eradication of poverty. I talk about it, people almost view me as kind of some sort of an American pageant. As I'd like to eradicate poverty. It's actually not that strange. It's not that hard an achievement. I see somebody like, for example, Noel Brown, who brought in free education. And when he did so, he was seen as being strange, but then we wouldn't ever unsee that. We would never go back. So the eradication of poverty for me as a social democrat is fundamental to our very existence. I mean, obviously we want to bring it up to the Messel level, but we should absolutely be going beyond that too. And to aspire to live in a republic, that has decency embedded into its core. So that's something for me that we'll absolutely be working on and working towards in the Social Democrats for how long that takes. Never really equivocating on that and never seeing it as too far off a pursuit, because it is devastating to the human experience of those who are experiencing poverty. It is, to my mind, a form of structural violence initiated by the state and by those architects who built it over the last 100 years, who've placed poverty into the core of a republic. I think it was even at the foundation of the republic around 1926. Some Coming Gael minister said people in this country may have to die, and they may have to die of hunger. And in many ways, that cruelty has never really left. Is that any different to looking at the extent of the amount of people who've died on the streets over the past number of years? And it's almost getting to the point where we've been desensitized by it. So, because thanks a million to Zoe, Breed, and Joe, and Nuala, and Aidan, and whoever else was involved in organising this conference, because it shouldn't just be something we say that's actually really interesting. It should be your trajectory. This should be something that helps us realign and restart our course in the Social Democrats and go and commit ourselves to really eradicating it, because anything else is actually just not good enough. So thank you, and look forward to working with whoever over the next couple of months and years until we can get into a point where we have the pen in our pants and we're able to create our own budgets and design our own legislation. And when we do so, we must do so with these very conversations in mind and those experiences that have been laid out. So thanks, guys. Talk to you shortly.
Thank you so much, Gary. Thank you very much. And again, I think I don't speak just for myself when I say you're doing us all very, very proud in there in terms of bringing, because I know I love to hear us speak about values in policy, because when we see it in housing, when we see it in education, when we see it in so many different, the values that underpin the policies that are written and implemented are so important. And I think what we're seeing now as members is the likes of yourself and the rest of the parliamentary party bring those values into asking the right questions and making the right noises. So thanks for continuing that. Yeah, it's great to see. So what we might do just before we finish up, we've got 1 minute left. I might just share my screen once more and just show you the answers that you've come up with. So here are some of the answers in terms of what supports are needed post-pandemic. So we'll go up. We need income support, care hours, dignity, improved public services, a basic floor of dignity that no one can fall below, diverse and equal supports, emotional and mental health supports, challenge the punch-down narrative, support families, UBI, universal healthcare, education, removal of the welfare cheats narrative, give people dignity, upskilling and reskilling if wanted, stop commodifying unemployed people, dignity in the system, the same rapid access to payment for all claimants as was afforded to PUP claimants, supports that recognise the trauma and mental health effects of living through a pandemic and see the person as a person who needs to heal rather than a cog in a machine that can just jump right back to functioning the same as before. A person-centred public employment service accessible to everyone of working age and improved social welfare payments. A system designed around meeting needs, supports to retrain in other areas, and public services that give everyone a good standard of life. So that's it. Folks, I'd like to bring the second of our webinars to an end by just once again thanking our panelists, Zoe Hughes, Breed O'Brien, Joe Whelan, and of course Gary Gannon to finish us off. I would also like to thank everyone involved in organising tonight's event, notably Sabrina, who kept us all going technically. And finally, thanks to you all who've given of your lovely sunny evening to attend tonight's event. We hope it has encouraged you to question the social welfare policies and also the values of those who write and implement those. This won't be the last time we're doing this and speaking about these issues. Hopefully you'll join us in the future for the next in the series. But again, to thank you all and send you on your way. Have a good evening.
Thanks very much. See you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.